rusting relics that helped build America.
The structure was home to revolutionary technologies, ones that would go on to help save countless lives.
Ancient technology in a lost world.
It's like being in a sundial. These guys are mathematical geniuses.
A Welsh island transformed into a magical attraction.
They wanted to make it their home, but they also had something else that they were bringing along that was a little bit unusual.
And a training ground for elite communists.
The men who passed through here went on to prominent positions.
Decaying relics. Shadows of lost worlds. Ruins haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. At the end of a blustery beach in Wales, there's an imposing ruin on a jagged outcrop.
You're sort of at this idyllic British beach, and you look over and you've got this rocky island.
During high tide, this place is entirely cut off, trapping anyone on the island.
As the tide drains away, slowly the bottom steps of the staircase are revealed.
Battered by the elements, it's a daunting place.
When you've made it all the way to the top, you arrive at this huge, solid steel door, secured by a big bolt. And it makes you wonder, what's inside?
It's the sort of place as a kid you'd think it'd be really fun to get onto, but also you'd be quite worried about it being some kind of strange lair in there.
There were once less permanent structures added to the roof of the fort.
These were very basic wooden structures covered with wire netting.
They also had some open-air cages up on the top.
Who or what was living here that had to be kept on the island with the help of this high tide?
Local conservationist Jinny knows more about the island than most.
I remember this bridge when I was a child was wooden slats and rickety and wobbly, and you could hear the waves crashing below you like you can now. I'm not quite so sure whether or not this bridge is more scary than the one that I used to cross as a child. And I didn't walk slowly like this over that one, I used to run.
This windswept outpost sits at the junction of the Celtic and the Irish seas.
The island is magical, you know, it's got secrets, got lots of history.
The little promontory itself is about 600 odd feet in one direction, 200 in the other, and it's a limestone bit of rock, very easily weathered away with water, so you get all of these sea caves.
Humans have lived here for 1,000 years, beginning with religious hermits who used the caves.
The island got its name after a chapel was built there dedicated to St. Catherine.
But traces of the chapel are long gone. No one's lived here since Jinny and her parents left.
I have lots of little memories and little snippets of things that happened here while I was a child. Came up here a lot. Probably not onto this bit, because it's quite dangerous, but definitely up onto the roof and over to here, this area here. You can see all of Tenby, the coast, Caldy Island, all the way over to Pendine Sands, and on a good day, Gower. It's amazing.
The Bat family once lived in the enormous concrete structure that dominates St. Catherine's Island.
When you look at the structure, the purpose is clear. This is a fortification that has fallen into disrepair. There's more here than meets the eye.
In the mid-19th century, the British built a series of defensive fortifications along the coast.
It was built here because of its prominence and its proximity to other ports in the region.
But even before the fort was finished, international relations had improved, and by 1901, it had been mothballed. But the story didn't end there.
We moved onto the island in 1968. I was 4 years old, so it's great to be back. Yeah, it's lovely. It's home.
The Bat family were the last of a series of private occupants to take over the fort. The first owner had decorated the interior with no expense spared. But by the time Jinny's family arrived, the strange fortress home was already a wreck.
I find it very wistful coming back here. You know, it's been through lots of phases, and it's been left a rack and ruin.
But back in the 1960s, it was perfect for what her parents had in mind.
They saw St. Catherine's Island and discovered that it was up for rent.
They needed somewhere to live, but not just for themselves. In tow, they had something quite unusual, which meant that the only place suitable for them to live was the fort, out on those craggy rocks down by the beach.
Jinny's parents had long dreamed of opening a zoo and had already started collecting animals.
They bring in a lot of exotic animals and they open a zoo in this abandoned coastal fortress. You climb up the stairs and you're greeted by the howls of monkeys. I mean, that's got to be the last thing you'd be expecting.
I don't think anybody had ever seen anything like this.
There was nothing conventional about the Bat family life here.
When we arrived, the tide was in, and Dad had to paddle over in a metal bath to collect us. So that's one hell of a way to actually arrive in your new home, is in a bath. So that was quite an interesting way to get here.
In March 1968, St. Catherine's Zoo opened, and it was a big hit with the locals.
And it was very popular, you know. There were queues across the beach for people coming up here. But I think people were intrigued, really, about how my parents managed to set up something like a zoo on an island surrounded by a tide, you know, an old fort with no power and no water.
There was a surprise behind every door.
We used some of the rooms for living in, and the other rooms were used for animal displays. We had a pet room where there were rabbits and guinea pigs and chicks. Another room had little finches and little marmosettes and things. And out to the back, in some of the darker corridors round the back, there were a nocturnal room and there were reptile rooms, because my father was really into reptiles.
The zoo was filled with all sorts of animals, from badgers and foxes to bats and birds, even exotic monkeys and alligators.
Jinny and her family shared this place with more than 100 animals. Parts of the old fort had to be creatively repurposed.
We've had some open air sort of cages up on the top where the gun turrets used to be.
This is my favourite place. So up here there were aviaries all the way around on both sides. And there were things like monkeys and hawks, lots of birds of prey. And then over the other side, there was porcupines. And then somewhere down below, there was a monkey.
Jinny's upbringing was certainly not typically Welsh. In fact, it was more like a fairy tale.
Tucked in little places, like on the stairs as you go up, there's a little hole in the wall and there were tree frogs in there. So, you know, there were things in little quiet little places.
One can only imagine being one of the children living in this family. You've got this wonderland that's your house, which is a little zoo, and you've got all these animals. It must have been a crazy and wild time for them.
For Jinny, every day brought a new adventure.
There was a spider monkey. I remember it pinched an old man's false teeth because he was making funny faces at it. It's a really strong memory.
But for Jinny's parents, life at the Fortress Zoo was becoming a struggle.
You have to remember that, we walked up those slippery, stony steps and everything was carried up there, The animals, the water, the food, absolutely everything was actually carried up there.
It's certainly charming, but there are inherent difficulties living on a tidal island like this.
Jinny's parents struggled on. But when her mother fell pregnant unexpectedly, life in the isolated ruin was no longer viable.
We moved off the island because my mum was expecting my brother, and living on an island where there's no electricity and there's no running water wasn't ideal bringing up a little baby. So we lived on here for 2, maybe more years, and then moved off the island and still ran the zoo.
Eventually, running the zoo became too much for the Bat family, and they handed on the baton.
It was not the end of the line for the zoo, but as new owners took over, things started to change.
Monkeys would escape their enclosures and climb down the side of the island and end up marauding around the beach.
But by the mid-1970s, Britain had passed new laws that required dangerous wild animals to be kept in large enclosures. And the strange configuration of St. Catherine's Island was no longer fit for purpose.
In the end, the zoo was shut down for animal welfare purposes, but the animals themselves were actually rehoused elsewhere.
The Fortress Zoo was left to rot.
You can't argue with the grandeur of the location. How well suited this place is to house these animals, well, that's another question. There are plans in the works to refurbish the fort a bit, turn it into more of a tourist destination, but those are still in the future.
The monkeys that used to roam the beach are now just a distant memory of a bygone era.
And Jinny's left with memories of that special family time.
It's an abandoned, beautiful building, and it should be open to the public to see what an amazing structure it is. I was lucky I lived on here.
In the lovely Croatian countryside lies a strange-looking building.
We're in a beautiful, lush corner of the Balkans, right along the frontier of Croatia and Slovenia. A beautiful spot, once prized for its good farmland.
But this building does not fit in with this bucolic landscape. It's sharply angular with these steep sloping sides.
Its great size seems to make little sense.
As you walk in, there's this huge lobby area, and there's also this amazing bar area with fixed wooden stools.
You're struck by the sheer extent of the place, and long corridors, dormitories on either side, big conference rooms.
There's a huge room that seems like a cinema. It's dark and kind of oppressive.
It's completely rotted out with seats that are just destroyed by water.
Inside the derelict building, there's also some kind of library.
The ground is littered with books and pamphlets and other detritus.
It's really interesting to look at what's there now because you do see scattered amongst it volumes of Marxist thought.
These books could be key to understanding what this place once was and why the world no longer has any use for it. It's almost 50 years since Branko Pratengratsa first set foot in this building, which dominates the tiny Croatian village of Kumrovec.
Kada se nalazim pred ovim objektom, hvata me nostalgija i to jaka nostalgija. Jednostavno, kada danas gledam to, srce me zaboli. Veoma bih rado da izmijenimo što se to u zadnjih 40 godina dogodilo.
Back then, Croatia was part of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, which was formed at the end of the Second World War. This union of fractious Balkan states was headed up by communist leader Josip Broz Tito.
Tito's brand of communism, which was known as Titoism, had a pragmatic approach, and it didn't try to achieve the level of purity that the ideology coming out of the Soviet Union possessed.
Tito realizes that there's a real, lack of solid theoretical education inside Yugoslavia. People all say, oh, we're communists, but they don't understand why they're communists. So Tito wanted to set up a school where they would learn communist theory and explain why communism was necessary for Yugoslavia.
This is the Josip Broz Tito Political School. But why was it built in the backwoods of Croatia?
The town of Kumrovec was chosen because it was Josip Broz Tito's birthplace. And in the 1970s, Tito undertook to transform Kumrovec into a center of Yugoslavian political thought and education.
Tito's political school opened in 1981. Branko and the other students would learn their leader's philosophy on keeping the peace in the Balkans.
And so it was a school that was meant to deepen people's knowledge. It was one of the most prestigious schools of political learning.
Ulazim kroz ulaz za polaznike. Ovdje smo odmah desno navratili do recepcije. Ovaj foaje ili ovaj prostor ovdje služio je i za zabavu, pa su se ovdje održavali i pljesnjaci i kulturno-umjetnički programi. Ovo je ostatak bara, kafe bara iz onog vremena, na kome su se predivne priče pričale.
Yugoslavia's brightest minds were trained here.
Manja prostorija za učenje u kojima je nekoliko polaznika raspravljalo neke uže teme su ove kabine ovdje. Mi smo ih u šali zvali ispovjedaonice.
The students had privileged access to resources that were denied to many in Yugoslavia at the time.
Nalazimo se u velikoj dvorani koja je bila kako za predavanja, tako i za prikazivanje filmova. Ovdje vidimo jednu veliku hrpu knjiga. Mahom je to marksistička literatura, jer sve smo to proučavali. Završetkom političke škole nisi postajao više obrazovan u formalnom smislu, nego si jednostavno bio osposobljen za partijski rad.
The men who passed through here went on to prominent positions in the Yugoslav political apparatus.
But the school's students would learn about Tito as a former leader.
Tito died a year before the school opened, and with Tito's death, this idea of a Yugoslavia united under the rule of this communist strongman started to decline. And the school was also beginning to wither.
With Tito gone, Yugoslavia's member states no longer wanted to fund his political school. But, like Yugoslavia itself, it managed to survive another decade.
After the school shut in 1990, it was first taken over by the Interior Ministry and subsequently by the Defense Ministry.
Kada su te 90. godine u jesen ovdje počeli dolaziti na obuku vojnici u elitne jedinice Hrvatske vojske.
This is a time when Yugoslavia is breaking up. It's being torn by these ethnic fissures between its groups, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, and others, and particularly in Croatia.
In 1991, a bitter war broke out.
Things get rapidly worse when the civil war spreads into Croatia. There's a huge battle at a place called Vukovar. The Serbs take it. The Croatian population then migrates back here, and they use this political school as essentially a refugee camp during this Yugoslav civil war. All of these dormitories that were created for political cadres are now used as bedrooms for refugees.
When the refugees finally left in 2003, the Croatian authorities no longer wanted to celebrate Titoism, and the school fell into disrepair.
Izuzetno sam tužan što je ovaj objekat ovakav kakav je. Mi smo se razračunali u najvećem dijelu sa komunističkom prošlošću.
This building and what happened in it influenced the minds of hundreds, perhaps thousands, many of whom still occupy positions of power in the former Yugoslavia. So its influence continues to live on even after the building itself has been abandoned.
In a suburb of New York City, there's a boarded-up building with an illustrious past.
There's this well-designed red brick building. It looks pretty self-contained.
It could be a factory or maybe even some kind of old Victorian workhouse out of a Dickens novel.
There was a lot of care that went into these beautiful arches and lovely brick design, so there was obviously something that was really important here.
It's the surrounding geography that offers some clues.
The rivers actually run on both sides of all of these structures, so these structures essentially form their own little island.
It looks like some of the areas are flooded, almost as if the site was designed to be flooded.
The building's interior is even more baffling.
There's this chaotic industrial mix of things. You have these pipes and machines that seem to be all over the place.
Everything appears oversized. This place was the target of an awful lot of ambitious engineering.
This facility was at the vanguard of technology at a time when these advances really could save thousands of lives.
Local historian Elaine Gold explains why it's the two rivers that are crucial to understanding why the building was established in the first place.
This was a mill site from even pre-Rev War era. It had several iterations as a mill. It would have been a flour mill, sawmill, and it was purchased specifically for the purposes of this facility.
In the late 19th century, there was a huge increase in population in America, and this area felt the effects more than most.
Hackensack, New Jersey is pretty close to New York City. So as the economy boomed after the Civil War, the population here boomed as well.
There are successive waves of immigration, and these people are filtering to big cities like New York and Hoboken, New Jersey, and they're settling in the outlying areas.
The number of people living here more than doubled in the first decade of the 20th century. It was all driven by facilities like this one, the new Milford plant of the Hackensack Water Company.
It was built as a result of a contract that was signed with the city of Hoboken and the Hackensack Water Company to provide water to that city directly.
It meant that people would no longer have to collect their water from local wells or rivers.
The purpose of this facility was to pump water from the Hackensack River and to service the city of Hackensack as well as the city of Hoboken.
The steam-powered pumping station siphoned water directly from the river and sent it straight on to the local population.
We're inside the 1882 pump house, so this was the first pump house constructed on the site.
The system contained large pumps that could pump a lot of water, but demand kept increasing.
It was a constant race to build bigger and better pumps.
This is the later part of the additions to the Hackensack Waterworks as the service area expanded and demand increased. Height was added to accommodate these pumps because they were equivalent of a three-story building.
In 1911, the company installed pump number 7. This was a vertical high service pump and could pump as much as 20 million gallons every single day.
With each rotation of the pistons, that was 6 million gallons of water pumped. What you're really seeing here is not only a chronology of construction of the actual building itself, you're also seeing a chronology of techniques in pumping.
You can almost imagine how loud this place would have been during work time. I mean, you would have the clanking of machinery, the hissing of steam, and the sounds of all of these pumps running at capacity. This plant was operating at a phenomenal scale.
As pumping power increased, problems with the water itself began to appear.
In the early years of the plant's operation, there were lots of complaints about the quality of the water.
They were getting reports that, the water smelled of old fish, that it was sometimes the color of milk when it would come out, and because the water levels were low up here, eels were pumped out of the Hackensack River here, sat in the basin, and then were filtered through and pumped down into Hoboken and ended up in the water system down there.
The complaints soon brought the authorities to Hackensack.
So the Board of Health actually went upstream to investigate what types of things were bordering this river, and they found outhouses and stagnant ponds and chicken yards and pig farms, and they realized that all of this excrement and material was making its way into the river.
There were other contamination problems to contend with. An influx of immigration caused massive overcrowding in and around the New York City area.
In every major city in history, diseases have spread because of contamination of the water. Cholera, typhus, and other diseases killed an enormous number of people.
The Hackensack Water Company had to figure out how to prevent this from happening to its water supply.
It's really impossible to overestimate how important water treatment was to Americans at this time. In 1900, more than 44% of deaths were attributed to waterborne diseases or other types of infectious diseases.
The company had to break new ground. The plant needed to become more than just a pumping station. So in 1903, construction began on 2 big settling ponds, or coagulation basins.
The process of the water traveling from the river through the pumps to the coagulation basin filtered out a lot of the plant growth that would have been coming naturally from the river.
This removed the bulk of the solid particles, but it was the unseen bacteria in the water that was the real killer.
The laboratories here would come up with a solution, and these processes would be used all around the world.
Another building here reveals this revolutionary treatment process.
This is the filtration building. Water would have traveled through sand pits and filtered down into holding tanks and then been pumped out for general public use.
Unseen bacteria in the water could prove deadly. So in 1908, the Hackensack plant became one of the first in the US to use chlorine to disinfect its water.
But it didn't really do anything to solve the issue of the bad taste and odor of this water.
Another process had to be added.
The chief scientist for the Hackensack company knew that activated carbon had the ability to remove contaminants in a process called absorption.
When any form of carbon is heated to a high temperature, it leaves a very fine powder called activated carbon.
It would remove a lot of the contaminants that caused bad odor and bad taste. In 1931, this water treatment plant was the first to use this activated carbon in a municipal water supply. By 1943, there were over 1,200 water treatment plants around the world using this technique.
Over the following decades, the waterworks continued to expand.
By the 1960s, the Hackensack Water Company was actually putting out a maximum output of 100 trillion gallons of water per year.
But Hackensack's New Milford plant eventually became a victim of its own success. To meet the ever-increasing demand for clean water, the company had to build a larger facility that simply wouldn't fit on the original site.
In May of 1990, all treatment and pumping at the New Milford plant had ceased.
Unglamorous buildings like this are often overlooked and underappreciated.
The idea that you can flip on a light switch and get light, you can turn on your faucet and get clean water, but these things were really revolutions, and they demanded enormous amount of hard work and creative engineering on the part of the people who really made this stuff happen.
Elaine Gold wants to commemorate Hackensack's leading role in building the modern world.
We are eager to reactivate the site in a combination of both museum and public park.
This building really is a testament to what can be achieved when you trust science and technology and put people's health and well-being first.
In Mexico, a great collection of ruins juts out from the dense jungle.
You've got to break through that rainforest canopy, and only then can you start to see signs of human habitation.
As you explore further, it becomes apparent that this was once a fair-sized city.
Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people interacted here day by day. But when they left, the forest returned.
The clues here hint at a complex society.
All over this place, you can find these epitaphs that it's almost impossible to decipher them.
This remote, overgrown place lay hidden for centuries, and even today it's slow to give up its secrets. But all around is evidence of sacrifice, violence, and conflict.
When did the last person leave, and why did they go?
Today, archaeologists like Adriana Velázquez Morlet decode the secrets of this place, which was abandoned more than 1,000 years ago. It's the work of the ancient Mayan civilization.
Bueno, todas las ciudades mayas tuvieron grandes especialistas de perfeccionamiento arquitectónico y estilístico.
Despite its size, the city wasn't rediscovered until 1931, when an American biologist spotted it from the air. This lost world is Calakmul, one of the largest and most powerful Mayan cities.
Calakmul era una ciudad enorme, aquí hasta 30, 40, quizás hasta 50,000 personas.
As the early archaeologists cut through the thick jungle, they stumbled upon Calakmul's pyramid, the highest in the Mayan world.
Se construyeron edificios muy altos para validar y legitimar el poder de los gobernantes reales, pues realmente se convierten en el asiento del poder político y no solamente tienen una función religiosa o conmemorativa. También son necrópolis porque son el lugar de enterramiento de los gobernantes. Se han encontrado varias tumbas. La tumba más importante fue la Nomdichak Kak, que es uno de los gobernantes más importantes de Calakmul.
This king's name translates to Claw of Fire, and at the age of 36, he took possession of the throne.
When Claw of Fire took over, he inherited the really rather large and powerful Snake Kingdom.
This kingdom, this snake kingdom, extended for miles around this place.
Claw of Fire ascended to the throne in 686 AD. A series of engraved stelae give archaeologists vital clues to understanding more about this mysterious and once mighty kingdom.
Son 5 de las casi 120 estelas que se han registrado en Calakmul hasta ahora. Bueno, son importantes porque registran episodios de la vida política de los gobernantes y de los señores divinos de Calakmul.
Further ruins unearthed here reveal more about how the Calakmul kings governed their people. 2 structures work in tandem to track the sun and identify significant dates in a sophisticated calendar.
Bueno, los mayas son bien conocidos por el gran conocimiento que tuvieron del tiempo y de los astros.
You are effectively in an enormous astronomical observatory. These guys are mathematical geniuses.
But unlike any other Mayan discovery, the murals of Calakmul gave archaeologists a unique insight into what went on here.
Some of the ornate murals and decorations that are inside these structures, they're depicting the everyday life of ordinary citizens of Calakmul.
Calakmul es el único lugar donde se han encontrado pinturas murales que hablan de la vida cotidiana y de la vida diaria en un mercado. Por eso son tan únicos los murales de Calakmul.
They helped to decode one set of Calakmul's ruins that previously made little sense.
Las investigaciones arqueológicas que se han realizado aquí parecen indicar que este lugar, conocido como Chiknab actualmente, pudo haber sido un mercado.
The Mayans used trade to keep the peace, along with a more savage form of diplomacy.
Estamos en el juego de pelota, el único que se conoce en la ciudad. Se jugaba a la pelota cuando había una victoria en una guerra. Es decir, no era nada más una diversión o un deporte, sino un acto ritual de enorme importancia para la vida política y social de la ciudad.
This game was very energetic, very vigorous, very colorful, and quite possibly deadly.
Yet despite its violent nature, the Mayans used the game to prevent conflict. But in the late 1990s, archaeologists discovered something troubling on the outskirts of the ruins.
There is a defensive wall built around this place. You don't build a wall like this unless you're really trying to keep people out, because they are coming to kill you and burn your town. This wall is there to stop this city from going up in flames.
For more than 100 years, Claw of Fire's predecessors had consistently won battles against Calakmul's main rival, the city of Tikal.
Tikal y Calakmul fueron dos ciudades rivales porque son las dos superpotencias de la época clásica de los mayas. Rivalizaron en poder político, en control territorial, en alianzas, en monumentalidad. Hubo muchas guerras entre Tikal y Calakmul. La historia de la relación entre ambas ciudades siempre fue de conflicto.
And in the late 7th century, in Calakmul, the young Claw of Fire was flexing his muscles. His opposite number was another young gun, the king of Tikal, known as God that clears the sky.
They were both relatively young rulers when they came into power, and they had a lot to prove, but they also potentially had quite a lot to lose.
In the year 695 AD, the two faced each other in battle.
These two cities are going to try to destroy one another.
Calakmul had won many great victories over the years, but this time, Claw of Fire's warriors were soundly beaten.
Fue muy importante y yo creo que fue definitiva para empezar a definir el destino de Calakmul. Sí fue una derrota muy importante que comenzó a cambiar el panorama político de la región maya.
Archaeologists now believe that Claw of Fire lived out the rest of his days in Calakmul. The city itself continued to grow, but it never ended its rivalry with Tikal, and in the 8th century, the population began to decline. By about 900 AD, it had been abandoned. Archaeologists are still convinced that many of Calakmul's mysteries remain hidden by the dense forest.
No doubt when this place was inhabited, the forest was pushed back for agriculture, commerce, but when they stopped, it grew through the very stones that they had cut to make this their place. This place no longer belongs to people. This place belongs to the rainforest.
But there is hope that the jungle will one day give up its secrets and finally reveal how Claw of Fire's Snake Kingdom met its end.